Hi, Clint Coons here with Anderson Business Advisors. And one of the main questions we often get is, where do you create your business entity if I'm buying and selling real estate? Well, there's really not an easy answer for that because it depends on a number of factors. And so in this session, what I want to do is run through some of those factors and how you can determine where you should set up your corporation if you're flipping property, or if maybe it's an LLC taxed as a corporation. Well, first off, you want to look at, where do you plan to invest? Let's say that you live in Washington State, but you're going to be investing in Oregon. Well, should you set up a corporation in Washington or should it be in Oregon? Well, right out of the gate, I'm going to recommend that you create it in Oregon because that's where the activity is taking place. If you have no business in Washington, why file in Washington? Because if you do file in Washington, then you have to turn around and re-register that corporation in Oregon as a foreign corporation doing business there. So the first question is, where do you intend to conduct your business? We have to figure that out. Now let's assume that in this particular case you said, well, I plan to invest in Oregon, I want to invest in Idaho, I'm going to flip properties in California, and I'm also considering Texas. Well, now we have a multi-state strategy here that we're looking at, and so now it frees up some other options for us. Do I set up my business in one of those states, then foreign file it in all the others? Or do I choose a jurisdiction such as Nevada or even Wyoming, where it could offer some additional benefits for me from a tax standpoint, because neither one of those states will impose a state corporate tax on my business entity, and I could possibly pick up some anonymity, and I can also have some additional asset protection that comes from those jurisdictions. So if you're considering flipping in multiple states, then what you might want to do is set up a Wyoming corporation right here. This is a Wyoming Corp. And then when you're going to take a property down, let's say I'm going to flip a property in Texas over here, you have a couple choices. You could register this corporation in Texas as a foreign corporation to do that flip. Or what I would recommend you do is you create a LLC in Texas for that flip. And this LLC is 100% owned by your Wyoming corporation. Now, the benefit of this strategy is that when you create this Texas LLC, if you don't want your name associated with it, you just make it a member-managed LLC. So that tells you that when you file for this Texas LLC, what's going to happen is on the Articles of Organization, it's going to point back to this Wyoming corporation. That Wyoming corporation is going to be listed there. And if you're using our nominee service that we provide with Anderson, then what that means is that when they look at this Wyoming corporation, because maybe somebody's trying to figure out who you are, who's doing the new deals down in our neighborhood, it's going to point them back to here, and they're going to see a guy named A.T. Mathis. Okay, A.T. Mathis is one of the founding partners in Anderson, and he's on over 17,000 entities between Nevada and Wyoming. He serves as a nominee director, an officer in your corporation. He also would serve as a nominee manager if this was a limited liability company. And what he does is, for filing purposes, he lists his name down with the Secretary of State, and then he resigns, and then you become the new director and officer of your corporation. So you take over, and that information is not disclosed anywhere, because in Wyoming and Nevada, you don't have to update the Secretary of State whenever there's been a change in directors or officers or managers of limited liability companies. You only do that once a year. Whereas if you tried the same strategy in Oregon or Texas, as soon as this nominee resigned, you would have to tell them who the new manager or who the new officer and director is within a certain period of time. So what you get here is this nominee, this anonymity. So if you have this LLC here and someone's looking at the LLC, it points them to here, and your information is kept private. And so privacy is a big part of real estate investing. In fact, that's one of the strategies I teach at our 3-day asset protection event, is that it's your second layer of defense. I mean, let's face it, if they don't know you have it, they're not going to go after it. And so we want to make sure that we're keeping our affairs as private as possible, not letting creditors know what it is that we have that could be available to them. And so again, if you're going to go out there and you're going to invest in Oregon, we do the same thing. We create an Oregon limited liability company here that's owned 100% by our Wyoming corporation. So this is a multi-state strategy that we would create. Now, I understand that some investors are not going to invest this way. They're just going to invest in their state. And so then it's going to be a little different. If you're just going to invest, again, let's say in Washington, that's where I plan to do all my investing, and I'm not concerned about anonymity, then if you're going to invest in Washington, just create one entity here. This would be a corp, this would be a Washington corp, and it could be an LLC as well. Watch one of my segments on the difference between corporations and LLCs, how you determine which entity you should set up. But let's assume it's a Washington Corp, and then of course you could flip through it. But if you recall in some of my other instructional videos, I tell you that you may not want to flip directly in your corporation, or you don't want to have a couple deals going on there, because if one deal goes bad, like this, if you had two properties inside of this company and one goes bad, well then this one's at risk as well. So I'm an advocate of always having your corporation own limited liability companies like this, and this is where your flip should take place. So if anything goes south, the only thing you stand to lose is this one LLC right here. So that provides protection for your other deals that you may have going on, or more importantly, maybe you're building up brand recognition with this corporation because you're advertising. And the last thing you want to do is jeopardize that money you're putting into advertising by having someone sue your corporation and take it out of the game. So by using LLCs, we're isolating that potential liability. But again, going back to anonymity, you're not going to have any anonymity in this structure. So if anonymity is important to you, and again, we start with Wyoming, and then we create an LLC in Washington that's owned by that Wyoming corporation. That way, no one would know that I'm investing in Washington, because everything's going to point back to my Wyoming corporation that has anonymity. Now, one last point here. If you already created a structure like this, let's say you have a Washington corporation or Tennessee corporation, depending on where you're investing, keep in mind that as a shareholder down here, your interest is not protected from creditors. That is, if you get sued, they could take your shares from you. So another strategy that I share with people at our event, and I think is really important, is that you should have your shares owned by a Wyoming LLC. That is for asset protection purposes. So you're not going to be a shareholder in your corporation. That is, if somebody sued you and they ask you, do you have shares in a corporation? The answer is no. I don't own any shares in a corporation. Just so happens that my Wyoming LLC owns the shares of my corporation. And the reason you'd want to do this is that shares are personal property. A creditor could take your shares from you. Whereas with a limited liability company, you have those charging order protections, which would prevent a creditor from getting after your corporation if you were sued individually. So as you can tell, there's different ways to go with choosing where to create your business entity. Thing you got to look at is, again, where you're going to do your business and whether or not you desire anonymity or not. My name's Clint Coons with Anderson Business Advisors.